ass like a good boy.
Some men spend a lifetime chasing a dream. Others stumble into one when the world thinks they're finished. Out in the far reaches of Montana, where the wind drags secrets across the prairie and the sunsets bleed fire into the mountains, an old ranch hand named Mark Bates found himself thrown away like last season's boots. And exposes a secret powerful enough to turn a rich family's empire to dust. This is the story of how a man's society dismissed Rose again, and how a horse found in ruin became the heartbeat of his redemption. Welcome to WesTtalesas A Down, where every underdog still has one last ride. Before we dive in, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves powerful Wild West stories. It helps the channel grow, and it keeps us bringing you more heart-pounding, soul-warming tales just like this one. The day Mark Bates retired should have been a day of handshakes, back slaps, and laughter drifting through the rafters of the Double C Ranch. 40 years on the same stretch of Montana dirt earns a man a little honor, at least in most places. But the Clark family wasn't most places anymore. Ever since old Arthur Clark passed on, the ranch had fallen into the hands of his grandson Jensen, a man raised on money, not mud. On ego, not effort. And on this sweltering July afternoon, that difference showed like a blister on a cowboy's heel. The air inside the main barn felt heavy enough to slice. Heat clung to the rafters like an unwelcome ghost, collecting in the dusty beams of light pouring through narrow windows. Horses tossed their heads, unsettled. Ranch hands stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in hand, their expressions tight. Everyone knew this moment mattered, everyone except the man in charge. Jensen Clark strutted across the barn aisle like he was about to auction off the whole building. Designer jeans so tight they squeaked, sunglasses reflecting nothing but his own smirk, and boots so clean they hadn't seen manure in their lives. He snapped his gold watch band against his wrist with every few steps just to remind everyone he was the one calling the shots. Mark stood quietly near the tack room door. He wasn't a big man, not anymore. Age had thinned him out, and the years carved deep valleys around his eyes. But there was something steady in the way he held himself. 40 years of sun, snow, broken horses, busted bones, and long nights had weathered him like the old hitching post outside the bunkhouse. A post that still stood straight, even if the world around it leaned. He had dressed up for the moment a stiff plaid shirt, tucked neatly. His old Stetson brushed off and shaped just right. He expected a handshake, maybe a carved plaque with his name burned into it. Maybe if the stars aligned, a few words from Jensen about honoring the man who trained half the hands on the ranch. Instead, Jensen clapped his hands loudly, as if hurrying along a meeting he was bored of. "All right, folks, let's get this over with," he said, pushing his sunglasses down his nose. "I've got to be in Bozeman for cocktails by 4. The silence in the barn thickened. No one looked at Mark. No one wanted to see what was coming. Jensen made a show of flipping through a folder. "As you all know, we've been restructuring, trimming the fat, removing inefficiencies." Several cowboys shifted uneasily. Everyone knew who those words were pointed at. "Old Mark here has been with us for decades," Jensen continued. "Longer than any of you, but he's slow now. Liability, insurance nightmare. His productivity reports are half of what they should be." Mark didn't flinch, but he felt every pair of eyes flick toward him. Jensen cleared his throat dramatically, then pulled out a single sheet of paper. Grandfather scribbled some sentimental garbage about taking care of him. But the ranch can't afford wastes of money, so instead of a cash pension, he paused for effect. "Mark, you're becoming a landowner." The cowboys stiffened. Everyone knew what was coming before the words even left Jensen's mouth. "You know the tract out by Cinder Creek?" he asked. A ripple of discomfort passed through the barn. Even the horses seemed to sense it. Cinder Creek wasn't land, it was punishment. A hostile scrap of rattlesnake country where the soil cracked like pottery and the air shimmered with heat. A place even coyotes avoided. There's an old trapper's shack out there, Jensen said, barely suppressing a laugh. A real fixer-upper. It's yours. Deeds signed. Congratulations. No applause. Not even a forced chuckle. Mark swallowed. He'd seen that shack once 20 years earlier. It leaned so badly the wind made it groan like a hurt animal, but he said nothing. Pride wouldn't let him break in front of the men he taught to ride. Then Jensen delivered the real blow. Oh, and a rancher needs a horse, he added lightly. We just bought a batch from a bulk auction. Most are fine, but one of them, well, he shrugged. We call him trash, dangerous, mean, probably should have been put down, but hey, you're the horse whisperer, right? Consider him your retirement gift. He snapped his fingers, and the stable boys led in the sorriest creature the ranch had ever seen. The gelding stumbled into the light, ribs jutting out like broken fence posts, coat blackened with filth, mane tangled into one solid knot. But the worst part was his eyes, wild, rolling, white with panic. The kind of eyes an animal gets when every hand it's ever known has taken something from it.
The horse reared violently, hooves crashing against the barn boards. Dust exploded around him. There you go, Jensen said, laughing cruelly. A trash horse for a trash cabin. Perfect match, right? The stable boys winced. The ranch hands looked sick. And Mark just looked at the terrified horse. Slowly, he set his hat on his head. Not out of pride, but out of something deeper, a decision forged in the furnace of humiliation. He walked past Jensen without a word. Past the smirking rancher. Past the men who didn't know what to say. He approached the thrashing gelding, breathing low, steady, as if trying to calm the storm inside the animal's chest. Easy, son, he whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I ain't here to hurt you. The horse froze, not in trust, but confusion. Mark gently took the lead rope, turning his back to the barn, to Jensen, to 40 years of his life. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. The walk to Cinder Creek was 5 miles of heat, dust, and silence. The sun hammered down, burning the back of Mark's neck. The horse spooked at every noise, every shadow, pulling hard enough to nearly tear Mark's shoulder out of its socket. But Mark never jerked the rope. Never raised his voice. They reached the shack just as the sky painted itself in bruised purples and blood reds. The cabin leaned like it was praying for mercy. Roof sunken. Wood splintered. Windows shattered. Mark stood there a long moment, letting the disappointment sink in. Home sweet home, he muttered. Then he turned to the horse, who trembled violently at the end of the rope. Don't worry, Mark said softly. We'll fix it. One board at a time, one breath at a time. In that moment, 2 cast-offs standing on a piece of land nobody wanted, something unspoken passed between them. Not trust. Not yet. But the faintest spark of possibility. The kind that only shows itself in men and horses who've been broken, but are not done. Morning in Cinder Creek didn't come gently. It punched through the darkness like a fist of light, sharp and hot, landing on the cracked earth with no mercy. Mark Bates woke to the sound of his own joints protesting, a slow, grinding ache that radiated through his knees and hips. Sleeping in a barn stall wasn't ideal, but the shack still smelled like something had died inside it 10 years earlier, and judging by the scattered bones he found in the corner, something probably had. He pushed himself upright, brushing straw off his shirt, and glanced toward the opposite stall. The horse, the trash horse, stood stiff, ears pinned, eyes wary. He hadn't slept much. Mark could tell by the tremble in his flanks. Mark let out a long sigh. Well, he muttered. Looks like we both made it through night 1. Didn't expect that. The horse snorted sharply, as if offended by the idea that he wouldn't survive something. Name's Mark, he said quietly, leaning one elbow on the stall gate, not entering, not crowding. Figure if we're stuck out here together, we ought to at least know the basics. The horse didn't come closer. But he didn't retreat either. Progress. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the second half of yesterday's apple, the one he'd saved despite his own empty stomach. He set it on the stall rail and stepped back. No coaxing. No pressure. The gelding stared at it for a full minute before stretching out his neck, trembling with suspicion, and taking it like he expected the apple to explode. Mark smiled. Thought so. You ain't mean. You're scared. The wind swept through the broken barn boards, carrying with it the dry, metallic scent of dust and sagebrush. Mark stepped outside to inspect the land, hands planted on his hips as he took in what Jensen had gifted him. Rocks. More rocks. And beyond that, an ocean of, even more rocks. The ground was as unforgiving as the Clark family's generosity. No grass. No water except a thin trickle from a spring somewhere along the ridge. The old shack leaned so badly that one good gust might blow it into Wyoming. And the only fence still standing was the one barely keeping the horse from wandering into rattlesnake territory. But Mark had rebuilt worse in his life. He'd rebuilt himself after every broken bone, every lost friend, every dream that had slipped through his fingers. This was just another job. Well, he said to the empty land, guess we get to work. He spent the morning clearing debris from the barn, sorting old wood, tossing rusted metal into piles, swearing when a nail bit deep into his boot. By noon, sweat soaked through his shirt, and his breathing came in harsh, ragged pulls. He wasn't 20 anymore. He wasn't even 50. But he kept going, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering how humiliating yesterday had been. So he worked until his muscles trembled. He fixed the roof with scavenged tin sheets, hammered loose boards into place, and hauled bucket after bucket of water from the creek to scrub out the stalls. His hands blistered. His spine burned. His knees felt like gravel grinding against bone. But slowly, painfully, the barn stopped looking like a graveyard and started looking like a home. Around mid-afternoon, he noticed the horse watching him more than usual. Not fear, not aggression, curiosity. That, in Mark's mind, was the first real sign of healing. When the sun began to sag low across the horizon, Mark cut a handful of tall grass by the creek using his pocket knife. It wasn't much. Not enough for a growing colt or a working ranch horse. But it was something. He piled it into the stall, stepping back again to give the horse space. "You earned it, fella," he murmured. "Seen plenty of horses give up with less." The gelding approached the pile slowly, cautiously, then began eating with long, desperate pulls. Mark leaned against the wall, and finally allowed himself to breathe. "Cinder," he said softly, testing the name. "Yeah. I think it fits." The horse flicked an ear at the sound. As dusk thickened, Mark finally forced himself to open the door of the shack. The stench hit him like a punch, mold, rodent droppings, and something long dead. He gagged, backed out, and waited until his stomach caught up with him. "All right," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "War it is." He ripped out boards softened by rot, swept piles of old bones outside, scrubbed the floor with creek water, and hammered plywood over the broken windows. It still wasn't livable. But it no longer felt like a tomb. By nightfall, he dropped onto the front step, breathless, drenched in sweat, and trembling with exhaustion. He watched the last strip of sun slide behind the hills and felt something he hadn't felt since Arthur Clark was alive. Possibility. That was the moment the wind shifted. It came sudden, sharp, cold, a warning straight from the mountains. The smell of ozone burned Mark's nose. Clouds gathered in a churning, bruised mass overhead. A storm. And out here, storms didn't just arrive. They attacked. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the valley for a heartbeat. Thunder followed, deep, violent, rolling like a cannon blast. Dust rose in a spiral as wind tore through the land, rattling the barn doors. Then came the sound that made Mark jump to his feet, the frantic, terrified scream of the horse. He sprinted toward the barn, heart pounding. Inside, Cinder was a whirlwind of panic, slamming the fence, kicking, eyes wild with terror. "Easy! Easy!" Mark shouted, but the storm drowned him out. Rain hammered the tin roof like someone dumping gravel by the ton. Lightning flashed so bright the whole barn lit up in stark white. Cinder's fear wasn't normal fear. It was old fear. Deep fear. Trauma that clawed its way back to the surface. Mark knew he had two choices. Let the horse break himself, or risk getting crushed trying to stop it. He didn't hesitate. He walked into the stall, not running, not shouting, just breathing steady, slow, controlled. The way he had done with 1,000 frightened horses before. He lowered himself to the ground, deliberately, slowly, until he was sitting with his back against the wall, right where Cinder could see him but not reach him. Lightning flashed again. Thunder cracked like the world was splitting in half. Cinder reared, hooves slicing the air. Mark closed his eyes. And he began to hum. Soft. Steady. The same tune his mother used to hum when he was a scared little boy listening to storms outside their old ranch house windows. A simple melody. Nothing fancy. But honest. The storm raged on for hours. But slowly, inch by inch, the horse's breathing eased. The panic drained. His trembling stopped. And long before the thunder finally rolled east across the mountains, Cinder stepped toward the man sitting on the floor and lowered his head. By dawn, when pale light crept into the barn, Mark woke to the warmth of a velvety muzzle resting softly on his shoulder. He didn't speak. Didn't move. He just breathed, letting the weight of that moment settle into his bones. Trust had begun. And there was no turning back now. The morning after the storm, Cinder stood in the paddock like a completely different creature. Not calmer, not yet, but present. Watching. Listening. His ears flicked at every sound Mark made as he worked around the barn, sweeping out debris and dumping buckets of rainwater from the sagging roof. Every now and then, the gelding would glance at him with a strange, uneasy curiosity, like a child studying a stranger who might someday become family. Mark felt the shift, subtle as sunrise. He didn't reach for it too fast. Trust was a skittish thing, pushed too hard and it bolted. Instead, he worked quietly, methodically. He reinforced the fences, tightening wire and replacing rotten posts until his palms bled. He patched holes in the barn siding. He carried water, shoveled, hammered, and sweated through his only clean shirt. Cinder watched all of it. By afternoon, Mark walked into the stall carrying a bucket of warm water and a stiff brush. "All right, son," he murmured. "Reckon it's time to see what's underneath all that dirt." He wasn't sure how Cinder would react. The horse had been beaten before. Mark could tell by the scars, by the flinch in his shoulders, by the way his eyes darted toward anything that looked remotely like a tool. So he moved slow. Steady. Predictable. He dipped the brush in the warm water and held it out, not touching the horse yet, giving Cinder the chance to react. Cinder sniffed at the brush, snorted, then looked away as if pretending to be uninterested. Good. Curiosity was a step toward courage. Mark started at the shoulder, far enough from the head to avoid scaring him, close enough that Cinder could see every motion. The first pass of the brush lifted layers of grime so thick the water turned black. Mud, manure, sweat, and the kind of filth that only comes from months, maybe years, of neglect. As Mark worked, the true color beneath slowly revealed itself. Not dull gray. Not ordinary black. But a shimmering mixture of white and dark hairs that rippled like smoke. A metallic blue roan, rare, striking, and breathtaking. "Well, I'll be damned," Mark whispered. "Ain't nothing trash about you." It took hours. The midday sun fell low, melting into the west, and still Mark scrubbed. His back screamed. His hands cramped. But he didn't stop. Because beneath every layer of filth, the story of this horse changed. When he finally reached the hip, his hand paused. There, buried under a scar, was something raised, ridged, almost invisible before the cleaning. A brand. Not a ranch brand. Not a Mustang Freeze mark. This was deliberate. Stylized. A diamond shape with a curling case stamped in the center. Mark's stomach tightened. That ain't from around here, he muttered. He moved to the horse's head, running a hand along the jaw. Easy now, open up. He slipped a thumb gently into the corner of Cinder's mouth. The gelding resisted only for a moment before yielding. Mark lifted the upper lip and froze. Tattoo. A racing tattoo. Son of a gun. Every thoroughbred bred for the track was tattooed at birth. This horse wasn't some half-wild ranch reject. This horse came from money. Real money. Mark felt the world tilt slightly. You've been lied about, he murmured. Thrown away. Someone wanted you gone. Cinder looked at him with deep, intelligent eyes that suddenly made a whole lot more sense. A puzzle had begun forming. A dangerous one. That evening, Mark poured himself a cup of bitter instant coffee, the only luxury he had left, and sat on the porch with the papers he'd gathered from the barn. His hands shook slightly with exhaustion, but his mind was sharp. A high-end brand. A racing tattoo. A horse disguised with filth. Someone had tried to erase this animal. But why? He needed help. Someone who could run records, understand brands, and wouldn't be scared to poke at the Clark family's business if things got messy. There was only one person he trusted with both the facts and his pride. Martha Higgins. Mark hadn't seen her more than a dozen times in the last few years, mostly at church picnics and town meetings. But she'd always had a soft spot for him. Back in high school, she'd even carried a quiet torch for him, though life had pulled them in different directions. She became the town clerk. He became the man who never left the ranch. He saddled up a makeshift seat on an old wheelbarrow outside the barn and wrote her a short note, inviting her to visit. Then he rode into town on foot 5 miles round trip, to drop it in her mailbox. The next afternoon, her dusty sedan came rattling up the rocky path. She stepped out, eyes wide as she looked around at the repaired barn, the cleared yard, and the shack that no longer resembled a murder scene. Mark Bates, she said, planting both hands on her hips. You've done more in a week than Jensen's done in his entire life. Mark chuckled. Low bar, Martha. She followed him to the paddock. When she saw Cinder, her jaw dropped. That's the horse they mocked you with? She asked. That's him. Cinder trotted over with an elegance that belonged in a show ring. Martha actually gasped. He's stunning, she whispered. Mark showed her the brand. Showed her the tattoo. Told her everything he'd uncovered. Martha's brows knitted together. Let me run this through the registry. I'll dig until I find where he came from. Appreciate it, Mark said softly. She gave him a long look, one that saw more than he ever said aloud. You're a good man, Mark. You deserve better. Maybe he had. But life didn't deal fair hands. You just learned how to play them. 2 days passed. Mark kept working, tending the land and the horse. Cinder gained weight. His coat gleamed. His spirit returned. The bond between man and animal deepened with every sunrise. Then, late one afternoon, a car came barreling toward the cabin, kicking up a plume of dust. Martha. She didn't even turn off the engine before running toward him, clutching a folder. Mark, she gasped, breathless. You need to sit down. Mark felt the ground shift beneath his boots. The tattoo matches a jockey club record, she said, voice trembling. This horse is registered. He's valuable. Very valuable. Mark swallowed hard. Whose is he? Martha opened the folder. He was reported dead. Stolen from a transport truck in Kentucky. 3 years ago. His real name is Northern Dancer's Echo. The name hit like a thunderbolt. Northern Dancer's bloodline was legendary, worth more than the entire Double C ranch put together. He's insured, Martha continued. $200,000. At least. Mark stared at Cinder grazing peacefully by the fence, unaware of the storm about to roll over them. The truth settled heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't just a horse abandoned as a joke. This was a stolen fortune. A stolen bloodline. A stolen life. And someone with power, was going to come looking. Not to thank Mark, but to reclaim what they believed was theirs. And then, the rumble of an approaching truck reached their ears, growing louder, angrier, familiar in all the wrong ways. Martha's face strained of color. "Mark," she whispered. "That's Jensen's truck." The war for Cinder Creek was coming. And only one man stood between a stolen horse and a powerful enemy ready to take everything. Jensen Clark's black truck skidded to a stop in a spray of gravel, the engine growling like something ready to bite. Dust billowed behind him in a thick cloud, rolling across the field with a menace that matched the man behind the wheel. Mark didn't move. Cinder lifted his head, ears pricked toward the commotion. Martha stepped closer to Mark, clutching the folder to her chest. Jensen slammed the truck door so hard it echoed across the valley. He stormed toward the fence, his expensive boots slipping in the loose dirt. When he saw Cinder, gleaming blue roan coat catching the late afternoon sun, muscles filled out, posture regal, his face strained of color. "That," he stammered, pointing at the horse. "That can't be the same animal." "It is," Mark said calmly. Jensen ripped off his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed into something sharp and dangerous. "I'm taking him back." "No," Mark replied. Jensen shoved a stack of papers at him. "I have the bill of sale. That horse came from my auction lot. You don't own him. You called him trash," Mark said evenly. "On video. In front of the boys. Told me to get off your land and take him with me." Jensen's jaw twitched. "That doesn't matter. He's valuable. Worth a fortune. You think I'm letting you keep him?" "He ain't a thing," Mark snapped. "He's a living creature. And he ain't yours anymore." The wind stirred. Something shifted in Jensen's eyes, a frantic mix of greed and fear. "This land," Jensen growled, voice shaking. "The water beneath it, the horse, you think any of that belongs to you? I have lawyers who will bury you alive." "You already tried that," Mark said. "Then you blocked the road. Cut my fences. Harassed a man who's done nothing to you." Jensen took a threatening step forward. "Sign over the deed. Or I swear." "Or what?" Mark cut in, tired of the boy's arrogance. "You gonna hit a 64-year-old man?" For a moment, Jensen looked like he might. Instead, he smiled, a cold, crooked smile. "Fine. If the courts won't take it from you, I will take it myself." Mark didn't answer. Because the truth was simple, words weren't going to win anything. But courage might. That was the moment an idea sparked in Mark's mind, reckless, impossible, and maybe the only chance he had. "You're entering the Founders race next month, right?" Mark asked. Jensen blinked. "What? You and that fancy warm blood of yours?" Jensen tilted his head, confused and arrogant all at once. "Yeah. And? Titan is bred for competition. I'm going to win." "Race me," Mark said. Martha gasped. Cinder lifted his head as if he understood. Jensen stared at Mark like he'd lost his mind, then burst into laughter. You can barely walk in the morning. You want to race me?" "You win," Mark said steadily. "I'll sign the deed. The land. The horse. Everything. No court battle. No fight." "And if you win?" Jensen asked, amused by what he saw as an impossible question. "You drop the lawsuit. Clear the road. And admit the horse belongs to me, forever." Silence stretched between them like rawhide pulled taut. Jensen finally smirked. "You got yourself a deal, old man." The day of the Founders race dawned crisp and cold, the kind of mountain morning that carried the scent of pine sap and distant snow. Riders filled the starting field, polished saddles, braided manes, gleaming tack. The event drew crowds every year, but this time, whispers flew like wildfire. Mark Bates was racing. With a horse no one recognized. Against Jensen Clark. Mark ignored the stares. He tightened the girth on Cinder's simple saddle. No fancy gear. No martingale. No crops or spurs. Just leather, instinct, and the bond forged in a storm. Cinder stood tall, muscles coiled, breath steady. Ready. Jensen, mounted on Titan, a massive, powerful warmblood, rode circles around them, smirking. You look ridiculous, Jensen taunted. Hope your old bones can handle 20 miles. Mark ran a hand along Cinder's neck. We'll run our own race, he whispered. The starter pistol cracked through the air. The riders surged forward. Titan leapt ahead instantly, Jensen forcing him into a sprint. The crowd roared as Jensen took an early lead. Dust rose behind him in a golden cloud. Mark and Cinder stayed back, trotting at a steady rhythm. Easy, Mark murmured. Save it. 10 riders pushed ahead. Mark stayed calm. Cinder stayed steady. At mile 5, Titan was still in the lead, but sweat was already dripping down his shoulders. Jensen was pushing him too hard. Too fast. Mark knew endurance. Knew timing. Knew horses. Let him burn out, he whispered. By mile 10, riders slowed. By mile 12, a few dropped out. By mile 15, Cinder's training on the rough Cinder Creek terrain kicked in. He breezed over loose shale, weaving around rock outcroppings like a creature made of wind. Soon, Mark and Cinder passed rider after rider until only one remained ahead. Jensen. Deadman's drop approached, the most dangerous part of the course. A narrow ledge. A 4-foot gap. A sheer fall to the river below. Titan balked, trembling. Jensen cursed, yanking the reins, kicking hard, striking with his crop. Jump, you worthless animal! Jump! Mark shouted. Stop! You'll kill him! But Jensen didn't stop. He drove his spurs deep. Titan reared, panicked, hooves scrambling. And Jensen slipped. He fell backward off the trail edge. Mark's heart stopped. By some miracle, Jensen landed on a small outcropping 20 feet down, alive, but screaming, leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Mark! Mark! Help me! Mark looked at the finish line. 3 miles ahead. Victory within reach. He could ride on. No one would blame him. But then he looked at Cinder. The horse who survived abuse. The horse who learned trust again. The horse who followed him into every storm. Goodness wasn't about winning. It was about choosing the right thing when it cost everything. Mark dismounted. He anchored a rope to Cinder's saddle and tossed the loop down the cliff. Jensen slipped it under his arms, sobbing. Cinder tightened at the weight, but Mark's voice remained steady. Back, boy. Slow. Easy. Muscle by muscle, Cinder backed up, hauling a grown man up a cliff with nothing but willpower and trust. Jensen reached the ledge. Mark dragged him to safety. Cinder blew out a long sigh. Let's get you home, Mark said. They walked the last 3 miles. Dead last. When they crossed the finish line, the crowd exploded. Not applause. A roar. Because people knew heroism when they saw it. 2 days later, Mark stood in Jensen's hospital room. Lawyer would open Arthur Clarke's sealed document, revealing a clause no one knew existed. Whoever rehabilitated a horse on Cinder Creek earned full water rights to the entire valley. Mark had met the conditions. Jensen had not. The land belonged to Mark. The horse belonged to Mark. And the water beneath the valley, the most valuable resource for miles, belonged to Mark. Jensen lay silent, humbled, defeated. I won't cut you off, Mark said quietly. But you're stepping down. And every dime of water profit goes to the ranchers you squeezed dry. Tears filled Jensen's eyes. Agreed, he whispered. A month later, a silver horse trailer arrived. A wealthy couple stepped out, the original owners of Northern Dancer's Echo. The woman burst into tears when she saw Cinder. But when the horse pushed past her and went straight to Mark, resting his head on the old man's chest, she understood. Sir, the man said softly, we'd like to transfer his papers to you. He stays here. If you ever breed him, we get the first foal. Mark nodded, throat tight. Deal. 2 years later, the sanctuary at Cinder Creek thrived. The shack was gone, replaced by a sturdy lodge. 10 rescued horses grazed peacefully under the watch of the blue roan stallion who once arrived broken. Cinder lifted his head whenever Mark stepped onto the porch, and let out a joyful, echoing whinny that rolled across the valley. They'd been called trash. But together, they became treasure. The kind the West never forgets.